Okay, so this morning as we kind of warm up and shake the cobwebs loose a little bit, I know Sunday morning class is, it's the beginning, and still some of the sleepies in your eyes maybe. We're going to be looking at the conflict that moved into the church between the Jews and the Gentiles. There was one existed outside of the church, and then when Jews and Gentiles became Christians, it moved in with it because the culture affected it. And so just as a warm-up and a reminder, let's look a little bit of that history. Why did the Jews and the Gentiles hate each other? What were some of the reasons for the conflict between them in the first place?
Looking up the root words behind both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the root word of Jew, the nation of Judah, or the nation of Israel, God, for Gentiles, the nation of other nations.
Right.
So right then and there, it's like in the state, you have those Judah fans, UK fans, and there's a rivalry or state. The nations, there's a huge rivalry. And even sometimes they develop into hatred. Think about nations to go to war with.
Mm-hmm.
So inherently in the terms, they're rival nations. But then of course, Christ took away the nation of Israel so that there would be no
Right. But yeah, it built into the name Gentile, it comes from ethnos. It's where we get the word ethnic from, and it just means nations. So if you were a Jew and you talked about the Gentiles, you were just saying, there's us, and then there's all the other nations. So there's just a natural kind of a us and them creation just based off of the name itself. Any other reasons that they came to hate each other? By the way, we're not saying they should have hated each other. We're just saying they came to hate each other. Yeah. Okay, so there is also built into that the fact that the Jews, and there's historical precedent for that, right? The Gentile nations having a compromising effect on their religious purity. Perry? Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Yeah. And that came out where, they would talk about being children of Abraham and we've always been free, and Jesus would address that sort of issue. One, no, you haven't. And two, look, I could have even these stones cry out, who I am. So there was a sense of their ethnicity and their genealogy giving them a sense of pride. Not that was what God intended, but that was where it certainly went. And nobody likes dealing with somebody who's haughty, so that would have had an impact. Any other reasons? Yeah.
Also, I think the example of Jonah, that not to say that it's wrong that they jealously want the love and affection of their father, but they wanted it to the exclusion of them. They wanted to keep it only for themselves. Now, the Gentiles had multiple gods, and that rightfully lies. But to even not allow God to love them, they didn't want God to do anything for them. They wanted it only for themselves.
Yep, so there was that sense of exclusion that you see with Jonah and Nineveh. It's like, well, I don't want God showing grace and favor to those Gentiles. Let him show it to us, but not to them. Yeah. Any other reasons historically that they might have problems with each other? How about just the fact that they went to war? You have David and Goliath. That's a physical battle. There's a lot of wars fought between the Jews and the Gentiles, and the Jews did not always come out well in that, I will say, as they were not faithful to God. There were times where they lost. There were other times where they won, but you have a historical precedent of just physically fighting each other, and that had an impact on things. As Kyle mentioned, we have in America, we have historical enemies, right? That we may not be at war with right now, but the trust level's very low, right? And so they would have had that same sort of thing. And you would have had, racial differences and things like that would have an impact as well. So, and this is something that goes on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So, you think about the impact that we have of friction between cultures in America, and we're a young nation. And yet we see the impact of things like that. Imagine you had that sort of animosity between cultures and ethnicities, and it had lasted for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, so that their children are being taught, and their children are being taught, and their children are being taught, and their children are being taught, to the point where you eventually get to where when Peter is sent to go to the house of Cornelius, he's afraid to go by himself. Right? He has to be told in a vision by God multiple times, it's okay for you to go to a Gentile's house. That's the level of animosity. So we bring all of this up because really what we're going to be looking at here in Ephesians 2, the second half of the chapter, is the friction that is there in the early church. We think oftentimes of the church as being quite unified early on, but that was not always the case. We see snapshots of unity in places like the beginning of Acts, but there were definitely friction points for the church. And one of the major friction points was the Jewish-Gentile animosity that was cultural prejudice built up over time. And that's going to be addressed in this section of Ephesians. And it's going to be addressed from the standpoint of understanding how glorious it is that Jesus removed that. It's the Hatfields and McCoys, if you know that reference, right? It's a family, two family sets that hated each other and taught their kids to hate each other, and it just continues to the point where you go, there's no way out of this. What if Jesus comes along and he says, I can fix that? Because that's ultimately what he's offering. So we have to, going into this, understand that particular animosity was there. And it was very, very real. You don't play with their kids. You don't talk to them. You don't do things with them. You don't eat with them. So this was a problem in the early church. And it caused division. Think about how often Jesus talks about unity. He came to build that unity. And one of the ways that had to be built was by removing these prejudices culturally that were inherited by the church as it came into existence in a time where those two cultures had so many problems with each other. So the first thing he's going to say in Ephesians 2, verse 11, he says, therefore remember that formerly you. The very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about former situations. So the group he's going to talk to first is, therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. We're going to go back and talk about some of that more. Remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Before addressing the Jews, he addresses the Gentiles. And what is the general point of view he's trying to get them to remember? What is it that he's focusing that from their former life they must remember? Yeah, they were hopeless, right? You were hopeless and you were without God, so you're hopeless and sinful, right? You were living a life that was excluded from God's system. So don't forget that. It's an interesting thing. How quick are we to forgive our own mistakes? Right? I'll give myself the benefit of the doubt pretty much right away. Right? There's always some reason I did something wrong, but then somebody else does the exact same thing that I did 20 minutes ago, and I'm willing to hold on to that. What Paul's doing with the Gentiles here is saying, now wait a second, before you get too worked up over why the Jews are dealing with some, as Perry said, some of that pride, and looking down at you. Before you get too worked up over that they would be so condescending to you, were there some reasons that maybe they should look down their noses at you? You weren't living as you ought to, right? They had every reason to look at your lifestyle and go, yeah, I don't think so. Look at the problems that those people have. And they were right. So from the Gentile standpoint, there is a level of humility that is called for. Humility is an important aspect of having unity. If you do not remember your former sins, you cannot have unity, because you will immediately move into the mode of, but I've got it figured out and you don't, or I'm right and you're wrong. And you that short-term kind of goldfish memory, you don't realize you were just on the other side of the tank 30 seconds ago. That's what we got to watch out for. So the first thing he addresses is that. Can you think of any examples of where having a short memory of your own sins causes division in the church? Or not even in the church, just having a short-term memory of your own faults causes division in other circumstances, in marriages, friendships. Simon the sorcerer comes out of that idolatry and where it was all about him, and then he starts heading right back into it. So one very real aspect is you can have division because if you don't remember where you came from, you might go back, right? So that's an aspect of it. Can you think about Peter and his interaction with the Gentiles? There were times where he forgot things. Peter's first situation with the Gentiles is Cornelius, right? He's sent by God, Acts chapter 10, sent to Cornelius. There's this entire conversion event there. The Gentiles in the household begin to speak in tongues. And yet, later on, Paul ends up having to rebuke him because Peter's showing that favoritism again and only eating with the Gentiles when the Jews aren't around. And so there's a case of even an apostle struggling with that memory of things. Yeah. James and John wanting to sit at his right and his left, and their mom asking, and it's like that's not the system that works in my kingdom. Yeah, they were really fond of the fact that they were asking for that promotion above the rest of them. Yeah, it does. It creates division when I'm seeking preeminence. I'm essentially, another way of saying is I want to be above somebody else. And if I'm seeking preeminence in the church, I want to be above other Christians. And that doesn't work out for unity. Yep, Diotrephes, who wanted to have preeminence amongst them. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Paul will make the statement, he says, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. if you're not careful, you gain knowledge, and you have Christians who've been Christians for years and years, and they've got all that knowledge, but they've forgotten the love and compassion, and they've forgotten where they came from, that they once struggled with those things. They once didn't know all the doctrinal arguments. They didn't know all the books of the Bible or all the different Bible stories. And so somebody else comes in, and they are struggling with that, and instead of having compassion for that, they look down on them. And people can feel that, by the way, right? Can you feel it when somebody has a condescending attitude to you? It's not like they have to walk up to you and say, I'm condescending right now. You just know it. You feel it, right? You feel it in your gut. People tend to know how you feel about them. And so you're right. I think that's a huge one when there becomes an education gap, a maturity gap in terms of lifestyle. We forget, man, I used to struggle with those exact same things, and then we don't have compassion for each other. Yeah, and then Mike.
I think you see in Romans, example of Christians dividing, been divided over, but the conscience of people that came out of their Gentile worship, having certain meals offered to sacrifices, and then having it done in their presence or around them, causing offense, causing a division amongst them. But then we also have an example in Corinthians, where you have a Christian who has his father's wife, and they wouldn't break up from him, but he went right back into doing the things that even the apostle says that even not named amongst the Gentiles.
Yep.
So you have an example of them maybe having the fellowship and breaking up something they shouldn't have, and then maintaining fellowship.
It can work both ways, can't it? Yeah, Mike? Mm-hmm. Right. If there is no love, we're not evangelizing well. And once again, now you're back to people can feel it, right? If we don't love each other here, somebody walks in and they're visiting, and they can sense that. They can sense that we don't love each other and we don't love them, and so the chances of conversion really go down, right? You will know them by the way they love each other. So yes, it is the glue that binds, right? Not just the academic knowledge, but the love of each other tied in with it. So, yes, yeah. Right. So you get that. Love makes you attractive. So, so as you look at it, these are the things that church was dealing with. And then he's going to address another issue, which is he'll talk about the Gentiles in the flesh who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision. Now, you can go over to Romans 2 and 26 through 29. In fact, we'll go and turn there and look at that real quick so that we can understand the biblical teaching on the circumcision issue in the New Testament. This was something that the early church had fought over, back and forth. Do you need to be circumcised to be a Christian? It had been dealt with in Acts 15 very clearly as not necessary for salvation. If you were circumcised, fine. Under Jewish law, you didn't have to become uncircumcised, but on the other hand, it had no bearing on your salvation if you were a Gentile and were uncircumcised. So verse 26, he says, if the uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you who, though having the letter of the law and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? He's not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor a circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. You imagine, you have an American citizen, and they have American citizenship and all of the laws of America, but they break those laws. And then you have someone from a foreign country comes into America, and they are not an American citizen, but they are obedient to America's laws. Who would you rather have as a neighbor? right? The person who came in, they're not a citizen, but they are obeying like a citizen. They're law-abiding, though they do not have citizenship. Or would you rather the guy goes, yeah, I'm a U.S. citizen, but I do murder, steal, all that kind of stuff. Of course, you would rather have the person who's obedient, right, as a neighbor. That's what Romans points out is the Jews had this problem. They would say, well, we've got the law. We're really great. We've got this law. God gave us a law. Well, if you go over to Romans in particular, the law just taught them one thing. You're lawbreakers. That was the message. So you have this law from God. You know exactly what God would have you to do, and you're not doing it. And yet, there are many Gentiles who were better human beings than the Jews, even though they did not have the Jewish law. And you go back and you look at people like Cornelius, that's one of the things that's said about him, is that here's Cornelius, he was not a Jew, but he was devout, and he was giving alms, he was prayerful, he's all of these sorts of characteristics that you wanted, even though he didn't have the circumcision surgery for the covenant. And one of the things that's being addressed here in Ephesians 2 is both being dealt with simultaneously. You Gentiles, remember where you came from. Because when you remember that, you're going to have some humility. You Jews who are saying there's the circumcision and then there's the uncircumcision. Look at the language he uses. You who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision. Why does he refer to it as the so-called circumcision? If I had somebody say, well, this is my, you met my brother, and I said, well, this is my so-called brother. How would you take that? Right? That's a dig, isn't it? My so-called brother, the so-called circumcision. It's a group of people who think their physical circumcision is the thing that makes them distinct. And he's saying, it doesn't. What matters is your obedience to God. So, Gentiles, remember where you came from. Jews, remember where you came from too. You came from having the law, knowing all the things that were right and wrong. You were raised in an environment where you had truth. Just you were saturated in the Old Testament scriptures, and you have failed it. Now, one kind of New Testament connection I think that we can make to that is those who are raised in Christian families and those who are not. Because that's a cultural difference, isn't it? If you were raised in a Christian home where you were given biblical values from day one, that's a wonderful gift. And it means you're less of a sinner, right? Nope, right? That's not how that works. Is it a blessing and a gift to be raised in a Christian family? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to give my kids. Right? If you are a Christian raising children, you don't think, I'm really not sure how good this is for them. Maybe I should just shove them out on the street and let them fend for themselves. You think there's a value to that. And there is. You're giving them truth early on. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to need salvation. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to have to rely on the grace of Christ. And we need to watch, as was pointed out, as our education in the Bible grows, that we don't begin to look down our noses at people. So that's a definite struggle. And when you come from not being raised in that family, not being raised with those biblical truths, you're going to have some humility that you have a process of growth, and that's okay. It's okay to have that process of growth. Did you have something? Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep, there is. There is a shedding of an old self, no matter what, that has to happen. Yeah.
A lot of people, they think this is a new concept that you only got to be like Colossians chapter 2, verse 11, about the circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
This was a principle that the Jews would have been very familiar with and should have understood.
Yep, absolutely. This idea that the circumcision of the flesh was not the end-all, be-all, was not a new idea, that your hearts had to be circumcised. So yeah, it's an Old Testament concept as much as a New Testament one. As we progress through, he talks about this idea of they were once excluded from the commonwealth of Israel. You'll notice as Paul teaches in Ephesians, he does not denigrate the Jewish beginnings. Because who started the Jewish nation? It's God, right? God started that Jewish nation. God began that process. So the commonwealth of Israel, commonwealth, think of it this way, it's the wealth or the luxury or the privileges that we all have in common. We associate it with citizenship. In fact, the Greek word there is where we get the English word politics from. And so it's this thing that we have based off of citizenship. The citizenship, the commonwealth of Israel, was that they were God's people. And that's a huge privilege. It also comes with some major consequences, because if God was upset with Israel, they definitely knew it, didn't they? Right? There's the blessings and the cursings. He is your father, and He loves you, but He also disciplines you as a father does. And what He's calling to when He says you were formerly excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, when He says that to the Gentiles, the implication is you used to not be citizens, but what are you now? You are citizens, right? Now you are part of that commonwealth. So now we have to make a statement of truth that we all have to get behind, which is once you become a Christian, you are a citizen with all the rights and privileges of all the other citizens, regardless of background, regardless of past history, regardless of how your age, gender, ethnicity, all of those things. Those go away. They're not an issue in terms of value. So if you're a Jew and you're saying, well, these Gentiles, I know they're Christians now, but they're kind of lesser Christians. Right? They're not us. We've been part of the commonwealth all along. Nope, that's not how that works. It's a shared citizenship that they both get to enjoy. So in Ephesians chapter 2, he'll talk about how they once were, but now he says you have been reconciled. So we're just kind of hitting on some of these major ideas. Verse 11, now in Christ Jesus, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for He Himself is our peace. Verse 14, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in His flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in Himself He might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross. Give me some other words for reconcile. Just, if we're talking about the word reconcile, what are some other words you can use? Connect, okay? Bring back together. What? Restore. Connect. Bring back together. Restore. Any others? So we have this idea of something that once was, and now we can bring it back together, right? So reconciliation, you can see it in the beginning, right? That means we're doing something again. So if you think about the relationship between the Jew and the Gentiles, an interesting thing about those two groups is they used to be one group. Before the Jewish nation, they were all one group, weren't they? They were all just mankind. And if you go back to Adam and Eve, were Adam and Eve Jew or Gentile? It's just if anything, they were just Gentile. They were just nations, right? They were just everybody. They were just people. And what Jesus did, and this is the beautiful thing, so there's a whole slew of other verses that cover this idea. Jesus came with the ministry of reconciliation, reconnecting these groups as just people again. just people who no longer had an enmity between them because of this law. And really, it wasn't the law of God in and of itself that caused the problem. It was their reaction to it, right? Because as Romans will talk about, those who sinned outside of the law still sinned, and those who sinned having the law, guess what they did? They still sinned, and so they still have the same problem, right? But there was this sense of pride and friction that we've talked about. And so Jesus came with the ministry of reconciliation, that we could make this one group of people that God was trying to bless. He tore down that barrier and made the two into one man, and he reconciled them. In verse 16 it says, reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by it having put to death the enmity. Where's the point of reconciliation? According to Ephesians 2:16, it's in one body, and where was the body? Ephesians 2:16. On the cross. If you want to know how important it is for God to save all mankind and how much He loves all mankind, look at the cross. Jesus died once for all. So you look at the cross, it's like, well, who did He love? Jew or Gentile? Both. Who mattered to Him? Both. So as you look at the cross, what you're seeing is a physical representation of what God has been saying all along, that mankind, all human beings matter to me. And this is something that had to be driven into the early church because of this friction between Jew and Gentile. But today we don't have that problem at all. We value all people equally, right? How often is it in life that we treat or feel either consciously or subconsciously like we're better than somebody else, or maybe you think you're worse than somebody else? That's another way you can do that, right? You get in an argument with somebody and you put yourself in a position of honor above them. Mankind is constantly doing it, as John pointed out, with even in the apostleship. There was that jockeying for position. Who's the greatest of us? That's a human struggle to see, well, I've got to be above somebody else. My light shines brighter when yours goes out. But when you look here, Jesus on the cross with one body died for all. So, in what ways then should the church model that reconciliation? Like, what should the church look like since peace was brought through one body on the cross because He died for all? What should we look like? What are some characteristics that the church should have because of that? Unity. Yeah, so unity. So what does that look like? What does unity in the church look like? Okay, so our demographic should be a blend. I like that. Yeah, so it's like it should be seen amongst the Lord's people that it's a combination of people from a variety of different backgrounds. That means we're doing it right, doesn't it? Yeah.
How all groups talk about nations. You have to buy in. If you want to be a member of that nation, you have to buy in what that nation is like. So there's a guiding principle that allows us. Because you and me, we can have differences. But then we can come to the scripture together and
Right.
work out those differences.
Yeah, so the citizenship is in a commonwealth, in a commonwealth, and based off of following that one person, Jesus. We're gonna do it Jesus' way, not our way. So there's that leaving of self behind. That is another aspect. When you see the church taking something seriously, what we should take seriously is the truth of Jesus Christ. That should be very important to us. What things should not be important to us? If truth should be important, what shouldn't be? Anything that's not truth. If it's not a matter of truth, it's a matter of opinion. Right? It's not a matter of truth, it's a matter of opinion or preference. Right. Yep. Right. And you're right. That it's there's only one way to have unity if the view is that we've got to be carbon copies of each other, which means we have to actually be aligned in everything. And eventually you're going to find something you're not aligned in, something that's different. And good luck running your family that way, right? Imagine if you said in your family, the way we have family unity is everybody's exactly the same. Y'all dress the same, y'all think the same, y'all talk the same. You would never, in fact, if you ran into a family like that, they would weird you out, right? So it's finding that we have some unifying principles, right? We follow Christ. So in matters of truth, we stand firm, we hold by it. If there is a thus saith the Lord, if there's something in the text, we absolutely hold to that, right? Because if we don't hold to that, then we're not a family of Christ. But then in the things that are my opinion versus your opinion, we'd be very quick to let go of those things. And as was pointed out, sometimes that's the real struggle, right? You're welcome. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and you look at Ephesians, what will Revelation say about him? You've left your first love, right? Yeah. You know, it's worshiping God in spirit and truth. And you've got to have both of these things together. You got to fit both of those pieces together in order to be pleasing to God, in order to be what He wants us to be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Talks about how our boundaries are walls.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the boundary lines allow people. So it's okay for us to have boundaries. God allows us to have boundaries. He has His own, and it's one of the things the book says. God doesn't try to make us, you know, love Him. He allows us the opportunity to love Him. And so if we choose to go off, He lets us go off. He lets us, you know, get in trouble. But He's always willing for us to come back. And again, we have boundaries in here, but we're unified in the truth.
Right.
And we let each other in because the whole idea of letting in good things, bad things. You know,
Yep.
and so I see that in the church, this idea of it's okay for us to like have our individual self. We have our individual family, we have our individual friends. But when we come here for the purpose of Christ.
Thank you for the plug for the Boundaries class that starts this Sunday at 4 o'clock. And yes, you're right. That's a lot of what we're talking about here, right? We set God's boundaries, not our boundaries. And that's important to know the distinction. If the boundaries are my opinion, right, and we're going to do the carbon copy thing, man, we have no hope. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you've ever been camping and there's campfire and it's cold outside and you start getting close to the campfire and everybody else starts getting close to the campfire, guess what you also get closer to? All the other people are getting close to the campfire. That's what reconciliation does, right? It takes Jesus, who's unchanging, he's the fire, and we all draw closer to him, and we will draw closer to each other. And so, yeah, absolutely. We're the ones doing the changing, right? And it's a process. Along those lines of talking about how that process happens, he will finish up this chapter by laying out, look, the foundation of that reconciliation is Jesus. And we can go to a lot of different places, but Matthew 28, we'll talk about Jesus having all authority in heaven and earth. Hebrews 1, we'll talk about in these last days, God spoken to us through his Son. And Jesus is the cornerstone of everything. And then Jesus sent out some apostles. And the reason we listen to the apostles is because Jesus sent them out. In the book of John, Jesus will say, if you accept the one that I send, it's like accepting me, and it's like accepting the one who sent me, which is the Father. Well, the word apostle itself means one sent out. And so Jesus sends out the apostles, and so you have men like Paul and Peter and James and John and so forth, and they go out preaching. Why do we listen to them? Because Jesus sent them. And so our unity is built around following the apostles because they're sent by Jesus, who has all that authority. And then we'll get into this more in Ephesians chapter 3, but Paul will point out that the apostles knew they weren't going to live forever. So the apostles and the prophets who were sent by God would write these things down so that long after they're gone, you and I could go to a written account of their teaching, which is what we call the Bible. The Bible is just simply a compilation of those writings. And so we have that written word, and we can trust that because those apostles and prophets were guided by the Holy Spirit. They weren't just speaking their opinion, right? They weren't telling us what they wanted the church to be like or our lives to be like. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with this is what Jesus would have them to do. Holy Spirit guided them and guided their words. And because of that, if we build on top of that, we become a temple to God. So our unity has to have a good solid foundation in order for it to be something that works. You think about the parable that Jesus told the man who went to build a house. If the storms come and you don't have a good foundation, the house falls down flat. And so this is the other concept that he lays out is here's the foundation, all that being built on Jesus. And then verse 21, he says, in whom the whole building being fitted together, right, there's the unity, is growing into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling of God in the Spirit. So our principle is we start at the foundation, and the foundation isn't me, it's Jesus, and we change from there. And as we all change and we grow, we become reconciled to him and reconciled to each other. Any comments or questions? Okay, we'll shut down class there, and we'll pick up in Ephesians chapter 3 next week.